house is a very direct response to a specific law in Tokyo which specifies the exact distance you must be away from a high voltage line. So most houses just keep out of the radius of the high voltage line. But Shinohara built this house so close to the wires that this invisible cylinder that followed the path of the wire, as the space you could not build in, became embedded in the, reflected in the roof profile of the house. You can see, sorry the image is not good, but you can see, I think, in the image on the left, the way the wires pass the house, the cylinder, the invisible cylinder along the length of those wires has been directly modeled in the shape of the house, and then some correspondingly interesting interior spaces. And as a way of generating architectural form, the obvious reference here is the work of Hugh Ferris, a New York architect, who in the 1920s took the New York zoning resolution of 1916 and drew pencil sketches of what would happen if you filled the entire allowable zoning envelope and produced these wonderful crystalline images of maximized New York, the maximum allowable building volume. And of course, the building code in Tokyo is based on those same regulations, based on studies of New York and other Western cities, to define setback regulations for buildings. So the setback regulations, they're not aesthetic, it's not about the way buildings look, it's just about very simply not blocking too much sunlight from your neighbors. And the rules are very complicated, and because of their complexity and their relationship to streets and so on, by simply following the rules in a very rigorous way, you are forced to create some very unusual shapes. These are the shapes that will result if you maximize the allowable building envelope on any given site in Tokyo. Now, in New York, unlike Ferris's sketches, New York in the 1920s, people built ziggurats. They were like low-resolution tracings of the diagonal envelopes that defined how big the building could be. But in Tokyo today, people just build the exact diagonal shape of the allowable building envelope. And there's an architect in Tokyo called Yasutaka Yoshimura, who has spent the last few years studying the effects of the code on built form. So rather than Ferris's approach of taking the code and then working out the building form that might result from the code, he works in reverse. He looks at existing buildings and tries to extrapolate, tries to trace backwards to work out what the law was that made the building this particular shape. Now here it's very simple. You just see the setbacks sloping up from the street, and where they impact the building volume, they slice it back on an angle. But sometimes the code can result in very, very unusual effects. Sometimes very, very awkward, interesting shapes. And obviously this is expensive and difficult to build, but land prices in Tokyo are so high and rental rates in Tokyo are so high that it is worth spending the money to build a shape like this to maximize the allowable rental space of the building. Now, in addition to all of these setbacks from the streets and the neighboring buildings, there's another set of rules to do with the amount of sunlight and the amount that should reach the neighbors and the amount of shadow that you are allowed to cast on your neighbors. And this can cause very unusual notches to be sliced out of the building. So again, because of the regulations, you can build this much, but you have to cut a hole so that sunlight can land on the neighboring building. And again, this is obviously an expensive, difficult, time-consuming thing to do if you're a developer, but the land prices are so high that it is worth making the most unusual shapes in order to maximize rental floor areas. Now these examples are not really the work of architects, they're not really designed, they're just they're calculated. It's just a way of maximizing the volume to maximize your investment on the piece of land. But in the hands of a good designer, these same regulations can be used to make very interesting architectural effects. If you look at this project here, I think it's probably a well-known project by Herzog and de Meuron, the Swiss architects, for Prada in Tokyo. And the shape of this building is purely an outcome of following the building regulations. Now, as you can see from the diagrams and the study models, the regulations aren't fixed. There's not an invisible envelope that covers every site in Tokyo that is perfectly fixed. They're parametrically defined, so if you move the location of the building around the site, it affects the way the setbacks move. So there's kind of a shifting envelope, invisible envelope. And so by altering the location, the size, and the footprint of the building, it affected the way the building had to be shaped. But nevertheless, it was still having to follow the setback regulations. And Jacques Herzog, writing about this building, has said, we actually tried to resist the code. We tried to find ways to make shapes that didn't follow the code, that hid the effect of the code. And finally we realized that instead of inventing a shape, we just followed the code. That was the most beautiful shape available. Now another example I also think is quite interesting is this project by Tadao Ando, which also is an outcome of the setback regulations, the Casa Armani store in Tokyo. And the reason I think it's interesting is because Tadao Ando is famous for very, very rectilinear, solid, right-angled or circular buildings, very, very rigorous geometries. He never designs buildings like this, but even someone as celebrated and known for a distinctive style as Tadao Ando is also forced to follow the code and find ways in which to make a beautiful form out of strict legal regulations. But for me, the project that is most interesting in its mixture of compliance with the law and transgression of the law is the Skytrace House by Kyoshise Takayama, which, if you look at these images here, the image on the right shows the courtyard which goes deep underground. This hole at the top, leads down to an outdoor courtyard. It's the same over there, which goes right underground. There's an underground level as well. But this shell, again, with all of the sloping roads and the different widths and so on, surrounding buildings, this basic volume simply is an expression of the building code, of the setback regulations, the zoning regulations, with one exception. This face here is just a design gesture. It's sliced back as a simple design move. So with literally a single stroke, this very kind of clumsy, code-defined form has been turned into, I think, a very elegant crystal of concrete. So all of my interest in these codes came out of my own experience and practice. When I went to Japan 17 years ago, I thought in Japan as an architect you can do anything. And I discovered it's not true. There are very strict regulations that you have to work with to be creative. So I want to now shift to some of my own work and practice, primarily with the office FOBA. FOBA is a small practice in Tokyo, which I joined at the founding. I stayed there for 10 years, eventually becoming a partner, and then quit 5 years ago. But I'm going to show some of the FOBA projects as my first work in Japan. And our first ever project was this one. It's a tiny little house in the middle of Tokyo, on a very constrained site, about 2.5 meters wide by 22 meters deep. These sites are called Unagi no Nedoko, which means the bed of an eel, long, thin places where an eel might sleep. And the design itself is incredibly simple. You can see here, there are 2 concrete walls down either side of the site, 2 floor slabs, a fabric skin covering, spanning between the 2 walls, and then a set of beams that span between the walls. Now, the reason these beams are twisting is because the fabric roof, you can see here, the fabric roof, in order to maintain curvature over time, if it's a single curve, it will go slack after a while. But if it's a double curve, it's always pulling against itself and it will never go slack. So to get this twisted roof effect, we simply made the 2 walls of the same but opposite profiles and then spanned the beams between them. And here you see the building in context. This is it jammed into its tiny site. The client's daughter thinks it looks like a fish, this big eye. And then on the upper level you have, you can see the beams twisting along the length of the building. As I say, the site itself is 2.5 meters wide, so the internal space of the building is incredibly small, like a corridor. And so you see the way that through this translucent skin, this is a high-tech fiberglass fabric coated with Teflon. Natural light falls into the space between the beams. Because the challenge in a house this compact is how to get natural light into the center of the house. So this is the way we did it, covering them all with this fabric. And then, of course, by night, the opposite effect happens. You have the house glowing from within. There it is. This is Shinjuku, if you know Tokyo. This is Nishiazaku, this neighborhood. And there's the house in its context. And that's me 15 years ago. So, But that was an experiment dealing with very direct physical constraints. How do you deal with the kind of tiny sites you find in Japan? The next project I worked on, where I became very directly involved with the code, was this house, completed about 5-6 years later, in which we were on a corner site where the house was so compressed and so small that it's almost an exact diagram of the setback regulations of the building code. When I designed it, I worked out exactly the maximum allowable volume, and then that defined the overall volume of the house. And then certain notches were cut away because of light and gardens and balconies and so on. But if you look at the finished building, which is here, very low cost house, you can see it's slightly different from this corner, because I made a mistake. I got it wrong. When it was under construction, steel frame was all in place. The neighbors anonymously complained to the city council and said this building is too tall. And the city council came around with a tape measure, and they measured it, and they said, yes, this corner is 10 centimeters too tall. So on site, we had to, during construction, reconfigure, work out how to change the shape, change the geometry of the roof, and rework out the cladding, the panels, and change the shape of the house during construction. So it was a very good lesson in not making a mistake when you calculate the code. If you try and precisely calculate the building envelope, you better get it precisely right. Now, I just want to show another house which was done with much more flexibility and freedom, also in Kyoto, designed about the same time. And this house also had to deal with the code, because from the street, it was able to be quite tall, but from the rear, it had to slope back because of the building envelope regulations. So it became like a mountain, a kind of a wedge a mountain of steps, let's say, a wedge-shaped building into its site. So from the street, it looks like this, but from the rear, it looks like this, a kind of a landscape of wooden decks, stepping up towards, in a loop. From the street, you come up to the deck at the rear, halfway up, then climb further to get to the top here. So the street's up there, then we stand in here on the rear deck, then go back up to the top deck and look back down on the street. And given that the house is a mountain, the spaces inside became, let's say, caves carved out of the concrete. And then we had the challenge of building handrails, balustrades all over the roof. I didn't want any balustrades at all, but the client insisted that we needed balustrades. But the concept of the house is not simply to follow the code. We also needed to find another logic for the house, another reason to develop, another source of ideas for the design. And the source of ideas was this. It was in Kyoto. The city is laid out on a grid, but within that grid you find small alleyways that are secondary circulation within the grid. Spaces like this, and they're only for walking, they're not for cars, because you have the very deep sites that you sometimes need to get to the rear site. So these publicly accessible alleyways can get you to the rear, and that spatial type became a source of ideas for developing the house. So these are some of the spaces inside the house, and inside and outside. You can see the kind of cave-like spaces with curving ceilings and walls. And then the exterior long alleyway space leading to the rooms at the rear. And then even inside the house, you have the main stair as this kind of tunnel carving right through the main volume. And then finally, the main space of the house is not a room, it's a courtyard, an exterior courtyard. But conceptually, it's intended to be a courtyard, a room without a roof. So it's part of the main arrangement of rooms within the house, it just doesn't have a roof. And this is the core of the house. And in fact, here is the main family living area, and this is the room where the grandparents live, so they're always able to see each other, even if they are living separate lives. And in the corner here is the bathroom, so people can share the bathroom without crossing paths. Now, to talk a little bit about the aesthetic regulations in Kyoto, until a few years ago, there were no aesthetic regulations. You could, how are we doing for time? How much longer should I speak? It's okay. Okay. So until about 3 years ago, there were no aesthetic regulations in Kyoto, for the most part, in a couple of places next to important temples. But basically, you can build anything you want. But then, about 3 years ago, they changed the law, and now every building in Kyoto has to have a gabled roof. So for example, this house I'm showing now, it's now illegal. You couldn't build it now. You could build it 5 years ago, you can't build it now. So everything has to have a gabled roof, and the challenge for architects is how do you build interesting modern architecture with a gabled roof? Tadao Ando, the architect of the boxes, he said when this law was enacted, I will never build in Kyoto again. So that's one approach, don't build in Kyoto. But if you need work and you want to keep practicing as an architect, you need to find ways to do it. So this is a house I finished 2 years ago now, in just north of Kyoto, in the mountains above the city. And here, it has a gabled roof. And the first thing is, it's all made of concrete. The first thing is, the entire volume is sliced out of the same, as if it's sliced out of the same piece of concrete. So the roof surface is the same bare concrete as the walls. It's been covered with a waterproofing, invisible waterproofing layer. So it basically looks like, if you can imagine, a piece of cheese or a piece of tofu just sliced up to give you the basic gable form. So the roof doesn't sit on the house. The roof profile is just part of the main volume. But more than that, if you look inside the house, the roof is not a hat sitting on top of the building. It's used to create internal spaces. So from street level, you come in at basically the landing level of the stairs, then go up half a floor or down half a floor as the house splits into 2 levels looking up to the view. This is possible because the house is on a sloping site. So here you see the way you come in from the street along. You don't come in from the front facade, you come along the side of the house, into the front wall here, then go up half a level or down half a level. And that means that even though it's a 2-story house from the street, it looks like a very simple, bare facade. You can't see any windows, a very small, quiet, private house. It's actually a large, open, double-story house. Now, I just want to finish this discussion of building codes and regulations by showing a project which isn't built because it's completely illegal. This project here, we designed as a proposal for how you might rethink the code. We understand the reasons for the code. It's light, air, and views for the neighboring, for all of your neighbors. It's a very good idea. You must have a democratic built environment where everybody has a fair share of all of the amenities of the climate and nature and so on. But that's perhaps not the only solution. So instead of building these strange pyramid shapes, perhaps there are other ways. One solution might be this. This Z-shaped building here, which begins by taking the long, deep, traditional townhouse, but extends it up into 3 dimensions. And the idea is this. If you make your house, all of your sites tall, you cast a big shadow on your neighbors. If you make it only part of your site very tall, well, the shadow is bigger, but so is the amount of sunlight that gets through. So this shape gives you, in effect, holes where light and air can get through to all of the neighboring buildings. So it's a way to get tall without causing too much inconvenience to the neighbors. Functionally, you get one function per floor, and the big space below, then the very smaller kitchen and so on, bathroom spaces, and the main living space up above. And then the effect is you have 3 garden areas, the terrace here, the balcony here, then the roof deck here. And then you can wedge this building into a traditional long, narrow unagi no nedoko, eel's nest site looking out to the mountains. Private space below, public friend, party space below, your private space up above. And they could be any kind of shape. They don't have to be Z shape. They could be various other shapes. And you could cover the whole city. You could somehow densify Kyoto, make it get taller, but in a porous way. So it's a kind of a porous urbanism that doesn't follow the letter of the law, but follows the spirit of the law, or the intent of the law. So, the intention of this project is not to criticize the whole idea of codes. I'm in favor of codes. I think they're a good idea. Because what's interesting is that these kind of volumes, these irregular polyhedral volumes created by the code, in a way they're like a diagram of the democracy at work, or democracy at play, let's say. Because the surface being delineated by all of these unusual shapes, by all of these setbacks, shows, it's like a diagram of the negotiation between individually motivated desires and democratically, collectively determined limitations. It's where they meet. It's where the individual building a building meets the community that wants fairness in the overall built environment. So I think that by building buildings that exactly delineate these shapes, you're showing the way that the negotiation between the individual and the collective is taking place, and perhaps revealing places where it might be modified or improved or enhanced. How am I doing for time? I can keep talking as long as you want. Just tell me to stop when you think we should move on to the discussion. I'm sure I have much more material than we have time for. So, if I just go back to the house I showed, which was the skip house, which uses the alleyways as a generating space to create the kind of web of alleyways that is the house itself. That's taking a space from the city. But I think that you can also take spaces from traditional architecture, traditional Japanese architecture, and find ways to utilize them in contemporary architecture. And there are a number of very interesting examples of this. If we look at the way a traditional townhouse is laid out, as I mentioned before, there really aren't corridors. The rooms just butt one another immediately without intervening spaces in a layout that's called an enfilade layout. And then you have these peripheral veranda spaces which give you access to the rooms indirectly. Sometimes these verandas are interior, sometimes they're exterior. And then you have the courtyards, the inner gardens within the main body of the house. So all of these ideas, the kind of enfilade rooms, the perimeter veranda spaces, and the inner courtyards can be used in contemporary architecture without having to look like traditional architecture. Now, Tadao Ando, a very famous architect, is well known for using courtyards, but his recent work also uses the idea of the veranda, the Engawa veranda space, and he does it in a contemporary way by enclosing a concrete box inside a glass box. And he says the space between is the contemporary Engawa space. So this idea of using traditional spatial ideas, I think has been done very, very intelligently in this project, because it looks nothing like traditional architecture. But if you look at it very closely, to study its planning, there are some resonances. The planning, this is the Kanazawa Museum of Contemporary Art. If you look at the plan of this building, it's incredibly simple in a way. There's a big circle, and then all of the galleries are independent boxes that float independently, like islands, or like the blocks of a city. And you walk between them and go into each gallery and out again. So rather than the corridor being the leftover space between the galleries, like connecting the galleries, in a sense, this entire circle is a corridor. And then the rooms. Now there's other very radical things about this building, because as a museum, normally in a museum you have one entrance and exit, and that's where you buy your ticket and then go in to see the galleries. But in this building you have entries all over the place. And you seem to have complete freedom as you walk around into the galleries. And it's very hard to understand how this is possible, but it's very clever. The plan is a little bit dishonest, because in fact it's more like this. What happens is, at certain places in the corridors, there are very large sliding glass screens that block off the corridor. So even though you can always see down these corridors, they're blocked off. So this grey area, you can only get access to if you have a ticket. So you can enter the building anywhere you like, and you have access to this entire white area. But you must come here, buy a ticket, and then you can go and see these gallery spaces. And then I think that you can make a very direct relationship to traditional Japanese architecture. This peripheral space, which relates to the garden outside, where people who aren't interested in art can come and relax and look at the garden. This kind of space, that's not quite inside, not quite outside, relates very directly to the traditional Engawa space of Japanese architecture. Sometimes the Engawa spaces are internal, cutting through a courtyard, as you see here in the museum, this kind of space. And then of course the courtyards themselves relate very directly to the courtyards you find in traditional Japanese architecture. And then finally, the idea of sliding screens is somehow related to the shoji, the sliding panels that you find, or the fabric screens you find in traditional Japanese architecture. I'm happy to keep on talking for another hour, but you should probably stop me when you'd like to stop me.
about the classic Japan and the modern Japan. And now I would like to open the ground for questions. I also have some questions because I don't know if you visit the inner harbor in Macau.
Okay.
For some years, there's been discussion about the new laws, and the new laws are coming out because it's a big mess, like kind of small houses like in Kyoto and Tokyo, and the negotiations with the neighbors is difficult. So the tendency is like to do Rebonji, to demolish many small houses and make them completely. But I think here you show the solution in Macau that to build in that area, there are many small studios, kind of creative industries, applying these solutions. What is your opinion, from your experience, that Macau can benefit from this kind of order in the old quarters of Macau?
Well, I think that I don't know Macau well enough to make any definitive statements, but I think that what we should think about now, at this point in history in any city, is to try and keep the differences. So, for example, I live in Kyoto, and some people who live in Kyoto want the city to modernize. They don't want the history to be too strong. And some people want to preserve it. And my view is that Kyoto is no longer an independent city. It's now part of Osaka because the train line is so easy and quick to get between the two cities that we should keep Kyoto as historical as possible and Osaka as modern as possible. So in Macau, I would say that rather than letting all of the neighborhoods modernize a little bit or be demolished a little bit, you should choose areas to preserve perfectly and other areas to completely modernize. So you can keep the contrast, and it means that as you, whether you are a tourist or whether you are a citizen of Macau, you can have different experiences of different kind of urban environments. You can go to a place and it's all old buildings. You can go to another place and it's a big plaza with very modern new buildings. But I think maintaining the contrast is very important. So when I say that you should make very small interventions, in some places you should make very small interventions, and in other places you should maybe think about a large gesture. But the important thing is to not to do everything halfway in every neighborhood. Keep the contrasts clear.
So question from the ground.
As you've very good experience in Tokyo about the law and town plan. Can you share with us, is there any good law or any good policy in Tokyo that we could learn? Or any bad example that we should avoid?
That's very difficult. Tokyo, because Tokyo is a special case. Because it was almost completely destroyed in World War II, they don't have the question of preserving history. There are a few historical places they preserve, but because the city really began from zero in 1945. But in Macau, I think you have a much richer history that's very important to preserve. I think you have this fantastic heritage of the Portuguese buildings and the way the Portuguese buildings have been hybridized, mixed with the Chinese culture to make some very interesting combinations. So the lessons of Tokyo are, well, I mean, Japan is a society that tries to be very fair. They want to make sure everybody has an equal chance in an equal situation. So I think when I travel around Macau, I see incredible wealth and I see incredible poverty. And I think we have to find, we all have a responsibility to think about ways of equalizing that and somehow allowing, I don't know, for example, if in Tokyo, if someone wants to do a big development, if they make a public plaza, they're allowed to make the building taller. So if you ask them to do something generous to the public, you give them a present in response. So if, for example, you say to someone develop a casino, you can make an even bigger casino if you also make a plaza, if you also do some kind of urban development in another area that will improve the neighborhood, just as a generous donation to the community. If you can somehow make a law that helps the equalization to happen.
along those lines, does Tokyo have a transfer of development rights plan? That you can buy airspace over an important building?
Yes, you can buy airspace of a neighboring site.
The other question was, does the building code extend to materials, specifically a cloth roof? Is that a hard one to get past?
It depends on the area. The house I showed that had the gabled roof, but all made of concrete, there was no problem with materials, there was only a problem with colors. It couldn't be a bright color, and it couldn't be white. So gray was okay. In Kyoto itself, in the central city, again, it's mainly about color. It has to be beige or brown or some kind of very subtle color. It looks like a traditional building. But in some cases, the roofs must be tiled, for example. And the idea is that when you look out over Tokyo, you see a sea of tiled roofs, as 50 years ago you used to be able to. But again, it's dependent on the area. There are no national regulations. Every set of regulations is set by each individual state.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. Just like you made a parallel between two types of negotiations, so the democratic negotiation between regulations and the right of the individuals, so the community on one side and the individual on the other, and the second set of negotiations between tradition and modernity and cultural influences and all that. Which one is the most difficult to work with? Which one is the most challenging for a very creative mind?
The second one, of course. The regulations are simply something they're very clear. You just have to work with them, and the more you work with them, the cleverer the solutions you can find. The cultural ones don't have correct answers. Tradition and modernity do not have correct answers. So it's always a negotiation. With the regulations, you can say, look, it's correct. With history and culture, there's always somebody who will argue and say you're wrong. And as a foreigner living in Japan, of course, I am in a very difficult position.
I do have a question as well. I have been to Roppongi already in Japan, and I found it to be a very nice area, right? But there's also one area in Japan, in Tokyo, where you have this huge building. It's an observation post. I think you can go to it's a very high floor where you can see all of Tokyo.
Yes.
Now, if you know that place and you look around, there's one building that really stands out. It's like a kind of circular building, right, with many cross ashes. I don't really know how to explain it. But it's a very not ordinary building. It's very creative. So my question is this: in Tokyo, with so many rules and regulations, is there really space for creativity in architecture? Because
Yes.
with all the setbacks and so on.
Well, the thing is, all of those setbacks apply if you have a limited site. If your site is big, the setbacks don't matter anymore. They're there, but they're too distant to make a problem. I think the building we're talking about is the Olympic Stadium
I think someone
in the Yoyogi Park. It was designed by Kenzo Tange for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. And it's kind of it looks like an enormous seashell.
Yeah.
It curls up.
Exactly.
It's a tension roof.
Mm.
It's a very beautiful project. That was in a big park. First of all, it's two things. It's in a big park. Secondly, it's a national facility. If you're doing something national at the level of that level of cultural and public importance, then the regulations will be removed for you. So you can negotiate to have the regulations removed if you have a good argument for it.
Right, so there are exceptions, actually.
Yes. So the other thing that's very important is, even though there are regulations, that doesn't mean you can't be creative. I mean, I think a lot of the projects I showed were people being creative with the regulations, using them as a challenge to be creative. Because, in fact, when you're a designer, the hardest thing is complete freedom. If you have a big empty site, you can do anything you want. Where do you start? You need to draw the first line. Most of the competitions are international, and so foreigners do have the opportunity to win, but it's true that the designs that are selected are mostly by Japanese architects. During the 1990s, during the late 80s, bubble period, when there was so much money in Japan, a huge number of very unusual museums were built. Very, very interesting radical architecture, but for no reason. Out in the countryside, they had one visitor a day, and they built a $20 million museum. Because there was so much money, and there was government funding, and people wanted some kind of culture in their hometown. So a lot of money was wasted on very bizarre buildings that no one uses, mostly museums and cultural centers. And it was very good for architects. And not just for architects who got the projects and could do very interesting work. It was also good for the architectural profession over the world. The bubble period in Japan produced some of the most radical experiments that have affected the way we all think about architecture. Yes, that level of public project, that level of client is very important. But what's interesting is the client, who was the government, the local government, or the main government, actually, it wasn't because they were really intelligent about architecture. It was because they didn't care. They said, here's the money, build something fantastic. And so, Toyo Ito, who's an architect I respect very much, he talks about the way in Japan architects are not respected, but it actually is a good thing, because it means they just do what they want. No one really looks over their shoulder. So it's very good for experimentation. At the low level of ordinary people, I would say in the last 10 years, it's become very fashionable to use an architect. So a lot of the reasons you see very interesting, unusual houses being built in Japan is because now, if you look in popular magazines, ordinary lifestyle magazines, it's all about how to choose an architect for your house. So, and not just for rich people, and not just very expensive houses. Some of the houses are very, very cheap. And a lot of it's about how clever an architect can be to use a low budget to make an interesting piece of architecture. So I would say in Japan, there's a very strong appreciation for design at what we might call the lower public level of just ordinary people. And so actually they're very interested in design and they support the architect doing interesting things. At the upper level, where you have great projects and lots of money, in a strange way the clients don't care. But in another way, you can also build interesting, unusual architecture. Does that answer your question?
Yes. We got some information that I didn't have.
You said houses can be quite cheap for the low public, right? How cheap can they be?
I don't think it makes any sense to talk about Japanese numbers here in Macau, but they can be, if you know what I mean by tract housing, like generic, ordinary, like from a big company, not from an architect, but from a company that makes houses. I don't know if in Macau you have many private houses, but in Japan, people don't like apartments so much. People prefer to live in, if you remember the photo I showed of Tokyo suburbia, they prefer to live in these kind of very conventional looking houses. And those are they're not designed by architects, they're made by house companies who just produce 1,000 of them across an area. And architects can design houses much cheaper than that, like 2/3 of the price, but much more interesting quality architecturally. So the important point is that for a person to employ an architect isn't necessarily an increased cost. They can actually get a house cheaper. So the problem is not money, the problem is the psychology. It's a brave thing to do to employ an architect. Because if you go to one of the housing companies, you know what you're going to get. It's like going to a convenience store. It's like going to 7-Eleven. It's the same boring one in the same package, but everyone has it, and you know it's going to be okay. If you go to an architect, you don't know what's inside the package. So there's a risk. And in Japan, people like to be conventional. They like to follow what everyone else is doing. So for a long time, no one used an architect except for very unusual people for their houses. But now it's become a fashion, and everyone's doing it, so everyone's doing it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe we can. Maybe the final question is, I remember, if anyone has some question. I have one for you. When you show the from of Tokyo, the small houses in Beijing before there were many futons, so the small houses courtyard and the few public buildings. And suddenly these are cleared up in huge towers. And I was very impressed because when I was discussing sometimes the Chinese urban planners, many of them refer about Japan, the Shinkansen, the bullet train, the way things are done, many models, and suddenly the Chinese model is becoming different. So how do you see, how do you compare the advantage of and disadvantage of the new Chinese metropolis like Shanghai
I don't really know enough about China, and the culture is so different that comparison is difficult. The same architectural project in Tokyo, say a housing development, you can build the same one in Tokyo and in Shanghai, and it will become a very different place because of the behavior of the people and the culture of the people using it. But I think that the Chinese situation is happening very fast. Perhaps it happened, the developments happened faster than it happened in Japan. And so perhaps things are being destroyed too quickly. But I know that in China right now there's a very strong movement to preserve the botanics. Now, the problem is this, if it's the same as Japan, the problem is this. In a place like Kyoto, we look at those traditional houses, and we look at them, and they are so beautiful, and so elegant, and so sensitive, and so wonderful in the relationship to space and light and outside. But for a Japanese person, that's just a smelly, dark house your grandmother lives in. It's not charming, it's ordinary, it's boring. You want a modern, shiny new house. They don't have the same sense of nostalgia because it's not exotic. For them, it's just old and boring and stuffy and dirty. And in fact, the Japanese government, for a while, during the late 19th century, early 20th century, they were strongly forcing people, asking people to destroy their houses and make Western-style houses because they said traditional Japanese houses caused tuberculosis. It was all seen as bad, old-fashioned, we must be modern. And it wasn't completely wrong. I mean, their modern houses do give you more daylight and do give you fresher air, perhaps, than a traditional Japanese house. So even though we look at the hutongs in Beijing or Shanghai and say how charming and wonderful and interesting, but perhaps for the people, we have to think about the people living there. It's just the dirty old house that their grandparents lived in, and they want something modern and shiny. So we have to find a balance that allows these houses to be preserved and used, but also enhances the quality of the life of the people who live in them.
Anyway, this is a challenge that I live here is to compare the quality of life between the Japanese city, the individual citizen level, public spaces, and the private house, between the big Chinese metropolis and the Japanese one. So we finish here. I would like to thank Thomas Daniel for his fantastic vision of the Japan from the city macro scale, big picture, as well the detail of the individual units of the macro scale, and also the problems, the challenges of the rules, the codes, and the way that creativity is designed over these rules. So Daniel, thank you so much for your